Hi, everyone. Welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Ella McDougall, and I am the facilitator for the CRN, as well as the Climate Ready Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy, which is based out of traditional Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. A little background on the California Coastal Resilience Network. We're a group who promotes knowledge exchange through monthly webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you'd like to join or watch past webinars. We also post recordings of the webinars, including today's, on our site, whose links can be found in registration and follow-up emails. Today's webinar is called Enhancing the Equity of Coastal Resilience and Adaptation Strategies, Tools and Practices from Georgetown Climate Center. During this webinar, we will hear about new tools and emerging practices around coastal resilience and adaptation. In July 2020, Georgetown Climate Center, GCC, released two new online resources for state and local policymakers, the Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit and Managed Retreat Toolkit. In this webinar, GCC Institute Associate Tiffany Ganthier and Senior Associate Katie Spidalieri will introduce both toolkits and present different tools and strategies for how local policymakers and community-based organizations can incorporate equity into coastal resilience and adaptation decision-making processes and outcomes, including a consideration of how these topics are evolving in the context of discussions around managed retreat. Tiffany and Katie will also share case studies from California and across the country where these different tools and strategies have been or are being applied to promote discussion and peer learning around these important but challenging topics. To further introduce our speakers, Tiffany Ganthier, Institute Associate at the Georgetown Climate Center, provides legal and policy analysis on adaptation projects at the federal, state, and local levels. Her work focuses on equitable adaptation. Prior to joining the Climate Center, Tiffany worked for the District of Columbia Public Service Commission, Broccoli City, the U.S. Department of Labor, and the District of Columbia Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. Tiffany was also student attorney in the Howard University School of Law Fair Housing Clinic, as well as the Environmental Justice Clinic, where she worked with the Environmental Defense Fund. Tiffany graduated from Howard University School of Law with a JD and from George Mason University, where she received a BA in Government and International Politics. And we also have Katie Spidalieri with us today. Katie, a senior associate at the Georgetown Climate Center, provides legal and policy analysis on adaptation projects at the federal, state, and local levels. Her work focuses on adaptation in the coastal sector, including evaluating land use and other tools and strategies such as managed retreat, to adapt to rising seas and flooding. Prior to joining the Climate Center, Katie worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and state environmental agencies in Maryland and North Carolina in permitting, environmental compliance, offshore engineering and infrastructure development, land use and community engagement and outreach in the place-based management of national marine sanctuaries and marine national monuments. Katie graduated magna cum laude with a JD from Cleveland Marshall College of Law and the University of Virginia, where she received 2 degrees with distinction in history and an interdisciplinary environmental thought and practice program. Katie is currently pursuing her Master's of Law in Environmental and Energy Law at Georgetown University Law Center. Just to remind you all of today's format, we will have our presenters speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll hold a Q&A section. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A function or the chat box. I'll collect them and review them, and then I'll ask them to our speakers. And this webinar is being recorded again, and it will be available for review after today. And so with that, let's welcome Tiffany and Katie, and I'll pass it over to you two.
Hi, everyone. This is Tiffany speaking, and I just wanted to start us off with just a little introduction to the Georgetown Climate Center. Since 2009, the Georgetown Climate Center has served as a resource to federal, state, and local governments working to reduce emissions that cause climate change and taking steps to make their communities more resilient as they adapt to the impact of climate change. We are based at Georgetown Law Center here in Washington, D.C. We are made up of two teams, the mitigation team and the adaptation team. Katie and I are both associates with the adaptation team. So just to segue into the work that I have been managing for the past 2 years. So I was the project manager for the Georgetown Climate Center's Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit. So with the changes we're seeing being driven by climate change all over the country, it's important to acknowledge that climate impacts especially affect those already suffering from cumulative burdens of pollution, racism, political and economic marginalization. So this subject is more relevant and more urgent now than ever. Even as the effects of climate change are more obvious and more urgent, the consequences of this country's history of racism and discrimination are also in the forefront of our minds and at the focus of our national dialogue. Next slide. So what's in the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit? So the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit builds on GCC's earlier work on urban heat and green infrastructure and sea level rise to provide a resource for best and emerging practices in adaptation planning. So our Adaptation Clearinghouse has an equity portal, which houses all of the equity related resources in our clearinghouse, and that has a strong equity angle, as well as our work with on the ground communities, like our work in DC to implement the district's Climate Ready DC plan. So what we sought to accomplish in compiling this toolkit is to kind of define what it means to take an equity-centered approach to prepare frontline communities for the realities of climate change and provide examples through our case studies of how state and local planning professionals have implemented the legal and policy tools to achieve equitable outcomes. So the toolkit is intended to aid local governments and community-based organizations nationwide that are focusing on centering equity in their climate adaptation initiatives. The toolkit explores best practices and case studies from a wide variety of cities and draws lessons from those different approaches. It also provides a framework to help people tailor legal and policy options for their own jurisdictions that advance equitable responses to the impacts of climate change. Next slide. So what's in the E? For purposes of this toolkit, equity is defined as an approach based in fairness, designed to ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities and resources. So in practice, building equity into climate resilience planning and implementation involves not just addressing the disproportionate impacts that affect frontline communities, but also working to dismantle barriers that have prevented frontline communities from thriving. That's why this toolkit focuses first on delivering diverse and inclusive engagement processes and how planning and implementation decisions get made and who has a voice in those processes. So we call that procedural equity. The second big focus of the toolkit is the substantive equitable outcomes. In other words, actually implementing policy solutions and programs that seek to more fairly distribute access to the benefits of those programs and investments, and also seek to remedy historic underinvestment in frontline communities. And finally, in the funding and financing tools section of the toolkit, we provide detailed information about the practical, legal, and policy options decision makers and communities have for ensuring that those resources actually reach the communities that need them. As I said, I was the project manager and the lead author of the toolkit. We had a few other authors tackle these subjects for the past 2 years and ultimately create this body of work. So moving on to the next slide. So procedural equity. So there are 3 chapters under this section. These 3 chapters explore tools that can be used to achieve procedural equity when addressing climate adaptation solutions. So that's community engagement and social cohesion, governance and budgeting, and data metrics and monitoring. Next slide. So for example, the community engagement chapter, which is located in the procedural equity section of the toolkit, highlights procedural equity principles and action items on how to effectively engage the community in adaptation processes. The chapter explores a number of procedural equity principles that should inform decision-making and a number of discrete tasks to ensure that community engagement mechanisms are included in adaptation process. The chapter provides resources as well as case studies of these examples in action. One of those examples is Georgetown Climate Center's and the District Department of Energy and Environment Community-Centered Engagement Guide, where we synthesize lessons from a year-long community engagement process to address flooding in far northeast Ward 7 DC. Next slide. So these 7 subjects are each a chapter under Equitable Adaptation Solutions. Each chapter also includes 4 to 5 legal and policy tools. And for each of those tools, the economic, equity, environmental, legal, and administrative considerations are explored. There's also a lesson learned section for each tool, followed by 2 to 4 case studies or resources representing best and emerging practices, displaying the implementation of each tool. So that's done for each of these subject areas under the solutions section of the toolkit. So today I'm going to highlight one chapter, which is the Equitable Disaster Preparedness, Response, and Recovery chapter. Basically, this is a high-level overview of that chapter and the legal and policy tools that are included. So for this chapter, one of the legal and policy tools is planning tools. Another is equitable opportunities for relocation and response to disaster. And then we're supporting the development of resilience hubs. And then there's equitable recovery tools, and then there's funding tools. This chapter explores those 5 policy options and tools. And for each tool, like I said, there are several case studies that explore the tool actually being used and implemented and actually have an equitable outcome. For example, the San Diego County, California Emergency Operations Plan, specifically Annex Q Evacuation, is a great case study that came out of California here, and I'm sure you all are all familiar with it. So it's featured in the Equitable Disaster Preparedness and Response and Recovery chapter. It's featured as a great response to disaster. It focuses on evacuation specifically by providing general evacuation routes and road capacities, countywide shelter capacities, resources available locally, and through mutual aid and access considerations for people with disabilities. One of the things that made this case study unique is that it was born out of the lessons learned from evacuating New Orleans residents during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, as well as Hurricanes Irma and Harvey in 2017. So Annex Q also contains estimates of the number of residents within communities in the county who may require evacuation assistance, sheltering, transportation, and help with pet evacuation, which were all key failed considerations in previous disasters like Hurricane Katrina. Next slide. Another great example on the East Coast is the Baltimore DP3. So Baltimore is at risk of hazards like flooding, precipitation, variability, and coastal hazards like tropical storms and hurricanes, sea level rise, and tsunamis. So the 2018 revision of the Baltimore DP3 identified Baltimore's vulnerabilities to hazards, including coastal storms, extreme heat, and high winds as well. The hazard mitigation plan focuses on developing strategies that should reduce or eliminate loss of life and or property damage within infrastructure, buildings, natural systems, and public services. The project connected the latest scientific research on climate hazards with community-based outreach to identify the priority strategies for the hazard mitigation program in Baltimore. The updated plan also added a strategy subcommittee consisting of agencies responsible for actually implementing the actions, and an equity and outreach subcommittee to engage community members with an equity framework for residents most vulnerable to natural disasters. The 2018 DP3 upgrade places a stronger emphasis on community engagement and equity than previous hazard mitigation plans that Baltimore has seen. So the DP3 also offers several specific strategies to increase social equity in the city, including prioritizing retrofitting and increasing the resiliency of public housing units in the designated flood areas and other high-risk areas. Also, prior to a hazard event, identify lead contacts serving vulnerable populations and coordinate actions to maximize safety and information sharing. And given increasing premiums, identifying programs and grants that assist citizens in purchasing flood insurance and making flood proofing changes. So Baltimore is, a case study on the East Coast that can easily reflect some lesson learned on the West Coast and what you guys are dealing with on the coast here. So all in all, we hope that these examples and other case studies featured in the toolkit will be helpful, of course. We understand that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to equitable adaptation solutions, and because no two communities are actually the same. So our hope is that this toolkit provides important background and it makes it easier for decision makers and communities and the communities that they serve to have these conversations and to plan together for the benefit of all. We actually have over 120 case studies now, and it's growing. As case studies are coming out, we're still adding. This is an online resource, and if you guys have any suggestions for things that need to be included, please feel free to contact us and let us know. So now I'm going to turn it over to Katie to speak to the Managed Retreat toolkit. Katie.
Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks, Ella, and all of you for hosting us today. So we're going to transition from a more macro look at equitable adaptation to looking at it through the lens of one potential coastal adaptation strategy, managed retreat. As will not be surprising to you all, rising seas and increasingly frequent and intense extreme weather events are leading many coastal communities to confront difficult questions about how they can best protect people, development, infrastructure, and coastal ecosystems from climate change impacts. The voluntary movement and transition of communities and ecosystems away from vulnerable coastal areas is increasingly being considered as a strategy for climate adaptation. In the face of unchecked climate change, the alternative in many places is unfortunately unmanaged retreat, and the consequences can be devastating. The first comprehensive online resource on managed retreat, GCC's new Managed Retreat Toolkit, combines legal and policy tools, best and emerging practices, and case studies to support peer learning and decision-making around managed retreat. With the toolkit, we're not aiming to say that managed retreat is always the best or will be a preferred strategy in a community, or that even makes sense in a community, but really trying to fill an informational gap to bring support for more interdisciplinary and nuanced discussions around managed retreat, acknowledging that it's only one part of the coastal adaptation solution set, and it will hopefully be able to have more of a presence while also supplementing traditional protection strategies through things like hard armoring structures and levees, and also accommodation strategies through elevations and floodproofing. Under the best of circumstances, we are using the definition that managed retreat is the coordinated process of voluntarily and equitably relocating people, structures, and infrastructure away from vulnerable coastal areas and facilitating transitions for people, communities, and ecosystems to higher ground or further inland. In practice, however, managed retreat is an inherently complex and challenging subject for state and local governments. But everything in this toolkit is really intended to make it easier for decision makers and the communities they serve to have these hard conversations and plan together for the benefit of all. The primary audience for this toolkit is state, territorial, and local policymakers in the US in coastal jurisdictions. But since a lot of these strategies from managed retreat aren't relegated to the coast, others in a more inland location could also think about using this to reduce or mitigate inland flooding impacts. I'm going to briefly walk through a few parts of the toolkit and some of the related case studies. The toolkit contains 8 total sections that present different legal and policy tools state and local coastal governments can evaluate to potentially implement broader managed retreat strategies. Section 1 is an introduction that tells users how the toolkit can be used and how it's organized. The introduction also includes an acknowledgement section that lists the literally dozens of policymakers, experts, and community stakeholders who inform this effort, including many practitioners and stakeholders in California who are integral to this effort. The other 7 sections in the toolkit fall into 2 primary categories. So first, the toolkit contains 5 what we call tool sections that identify the legal approaches that jurisdictions can consider to adapt to meet local context and needs around managed retreat. These include the 5 tools that you see on your screen for planning, infrastructure, acquisitions, regulatory tools, and also market-based tools. State and local coastal decision makers can apply each tool individually or think about advancing a potential suite of tools to advance more comprehensive managed retreat strategies. Lastly, the toolkit contains 2 what we call cross-cutting sections, one on legal considerations and one on policy considerations. Effectively, these sections present a deeper dive look into legal and policy questions and issues that are raised across all or most tools. So for example, one notable cross-cutting legal question is how governments can minimize the potential legal risk associated with the regulatory taking of private property under both the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and state analogs. Similarly, cross-cutting policy issues, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, include how to fund managed retreat strategies, facilitate inland wetland migration, engage communities, and plan for and make investments in areas receiving people who choose to relocate away from the coast. We're going to take a deeper dive look into two of these sections and some related case studies. So first, one of our sections is on acquisition tools. Within that section, we explore 6 different tools that can be used to help people voluntarily relocate from hazardous or vulnerable flooded areas on the coast. And what we're going to do is take a look at one tool in specifics, which is for land swaps. A land swap is technically the exchange, or why they call it a swap, of title to land in perpetuity between 2 or more property owners. This acquisition tool, compared to what you might be more familiar with like hazard mitigation buyouts, typically involves an in-kind exchange of property. So one property owner exchanging title to a property of another person and vice versa, instead of having an exchange of money. This can help governments where there's maybe a surplus of land or unused land, but potentially a shortfall in funds. Although funds could be used in some circumstances, typically it's sort of this in-kind exchange that distinguishes a land swap from other types of acquisition tools. Land swaps can ultimately take a diversity of forms, involve different numbers and types of property owners, and can be highly complex. But they also provide an effective means of implementing retreat on a large scale. Land swaps can occur between a government and private landowners, like residents and businesses, or alternatively involve other parties or intermediaries, like nonprofits or land trusts. Governments that own public land, including vacant lots, could consider land swaps to implement retreat for a variety of purposes. In a managed retreat context, land swaps can be used for 2 different purposes, including to facilitate inland wetland migration and ecosystem conservation by having governments acquire either migration corridors, so where wetlands are migrating inland, or higher ground, what we call establishment areas, where once they migrate inland, they're going to need some place on higher ground to establish over the long term and thrive there. Additionally, governments could consider land swaps to facilitate affordable housing transitions for communities away from vulnerable coastal areas by acquiring that higher ground that's capable of supporting safer, thriving communities. We're going to briefly take a look at 2 case studies that illustrate each of these land swap purposes. The Los Cerritos Wetlands Complex, located in Long Beach, California, has faced decades of degradation from human activities and development that's resulted in the original wetland size of approximately 2,400 acres being reduced to a few hundred acres of wetlands today. Much of this remaining wetland area is privately owned and used to conduct oil operations. The Los Cerritos Wetland Oil Consolidation and Restoration Project would transfer 154 acres of privately owned wetlands to public ownership as a part of a land swap arrangement. Specifically, as a part of this land swap, the 154 acres that are currently used for oil production will be exchanged for a mere 5 acres of wetlands that are currently owned by the Los Cerritos Wetlands Authority. This land swap is aiming to restore a major portion of the wetlands via mitigation bank, increase public access, reduce the oil production footprint and consolidate operations, and provide economic benefits from the increased oil production revenue. Regardless, this land swap plan doesn't come without complications and involves a number of environmental and social trade-offs that state and local decision makers have had to address, such as an expanded lifespan for the oil production facilities and a continuing or increased amount of greenhouse gas emissions and risk for potential oil spills. So as this example illustrates, this is an innovative way to think about using land swaps to facilitate managed retreat for the purpose of emphasizing ecosystem conservation and maintaining shorelines. However, these types of examples, as I mentioned, can be complex and complicated and come with trade-offs. And so it's up for local policymakers and state policymakers and communities to try and balance these trade-offs to come to mutually agreeable decisions. The second example takes us from the West Coast to the East Coast. So Edgemere is a neighborhood in Queens. It's located on the Rockaways, which is a barrier island off of New York City. Prior to Hurricane Sandy, which occurred in 2012, Edgemere faced challenges from being in need of economic development opportunities. For example, the city owns several vacant lots in the area. In addition, the community suffered from frequent high tide or nuisance flooding. After Hurricane Sandy, the neighborhood experienced significant damage that really made it a prime site or candidate for the city to support a community-led planning process that resulted in a community development plan called Resilient Edgemere. The plan really put together a long-term vision of what the community would like to see in its neighborhood to become more resilient. The plan is really comprehensive and touches on multiple different goals and objectives and crosses different sectors from affordable housing to flood mitigation. But what I wanted to highlight about this was how a land swap was used to help facilitate flood mitigation strategies and climate adaptation in Edgemere. The city provided for homeowners who are in the most vulnerable coastal area in the neighborhood. I know the image is small, but you can kind of see on the screen where the short-term vision of where people are currently located to a longer-term vision of if people voluntarily chose to move away, how that area could be converted to green space. And the city sought to implement a land swap arrangement with people in that hazardous area to swap title for their privately owned property there for a publicly owned property that's owned by the city in a vacant area further inland that faces less flood risk. And the city would construct and build a new home for them according to resilient design standards. This example shows how land swaps can be used to facilitate affordable housing solutions to not only make individuals and communities more resilient, but it can really help keep people local too, to maintain social and community cohesion and also maintain local tax bases. Moving from the acquisition tool section, we're going to pause for the cross-cutting policy consideration section and look at two subsections on community engagement and equity and receiving communities. The community engagement and equity section really builds on a lot of the principles that Tiffany talked about in the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit, but looks at it through, again, sort of the specific lens of managed retreat. While managed retreat tools and strategies will vary based on local context, one cross-cutting element is really clear. These decisions must be community-based, driven, and supported. It will be important for state and local governments everywhere to design and implement equitable community engagement and adaptation approaches. This will be particularly relevant for the development of laws and policies affecting frontline communities in both coastal, sending areas where people will choose to leave, and receiving areas where they may be relocating. State and local governments can start engaging communities by equitably fostering discussions about managed retreat at the start of climate adaptation and resilience discussions. While managed retreat is not always and will not always be the best or a preferred adaptation strategy in every location, government should encourage proactive discussions now to avoid precluding the potential implementation of less viable and more costly or disruptive adaptation alternatives later. Before convening these discussions, however, governments must work with communities to build trust where it doesn't already exist. Additionally, governments should work with community members and community-based organizations to identify and provide them with the tools and information they need to effectively engage them, allow them to engage in these discussions. And all of that will necessitate funding, not only for the actual projects on the ground, but to be able to support these community engagement and equity processes upfront. The consideration of engaging communities and how you can equitably do that is tied to this question of receiving communities, which I've alluded to. Some managed retreat tools, particularly in the acquisition context, so with hazard mitigation buyouts or land swaps, really present a need for policymakers not just to think about how they can help people get out of harm's way if they want to, but where are they going and what sort of role can local governments in particular play in helping to plan receiving communities. This is the broad term that's used to refer to locations where people may be relocating, and they can essentially be within a person's same municipality. So like we saw with Edgemere, it was an area where people could be relocating within the same neighborhood to stay local, or it could be within a different municipality, county, state, or national jurisdiction. While the geographic characteristics and land use patterns of individual receiving communities will inevitably vary, ideally they'll be located at a higher elevation or further inland away from vulnerable coastal threats. So at least, even though they could be hard to identify and plan for, at least from this perspective, people would be better off from a reduced physical risk standpoint, although that's not the only type of risk they would be facing from a social, psychological, economic standpoint. As a threshold matter, it could be difficult for policymakers to identify true receiving areas based on factors like insufficient data on demographic and economic trends, and trying to account for personal preferences in deciding where to move. Above all, if you were potentially caught in a disaster situation and you needed to move temporarily or permanently, you may choose to move where you have a job or your family and friends are. While that makes a lot of sense, that kind of data can be hard to put into a statistical model to predict where receiving communities might be. Regardless, where policymakers can adequately identify receiving areas, they will necessitate proactive planning for and investments in, among other things, affordable housing, supporting infrastructure, and critical services like schools. These investments, too, must be backed by sufficient funding. States and communities should work together to develop plans and create potential funding sources to support the development of receiving communities, to ultimately facilitate better transitions for people and communities who choose to move away from the coast. And we'll round things out with one final case study example, which takes us to Louisiana. The Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments, which is a mouthful, but it's a great program, more affectionately known as LaSafe. It's a pioneering effort to address managed retreat in a state where rising sea levels and riverine flooding are already a clear and present danger. The state worked to partner with the nonprofit Foundation for Louisiana, communities, and a diverse set of other stakeholders to implement LaSafe after Hurricane Isaac in 2012. LaSafe is supporting disaster recovery efforts in coastal communities that are experiencing high rates of land loss and increasing flood risk. LaSafe is a planning and capital investment process that's designed to address coastal impacts and other community needs in 6 coastal parishes. Through LaSafe, the state will help fund and implement 10 projects across 6 parishes, including in higher ground, low flood risk receiving areas. The state and Foundation for Louisiana also work with the parishes to develop 6 parish-specific and 1 regional adaptation plan. One of the most notable features about the LaSafe process is that it took 9 months, but over the course of that, the public-private partnership that managed this process convened over 3,000 participants in 71 meetings that were facilitated by community leaders and attended by residents, community stakeholders, and government officials. The meetings covered all stages of project design and selection, including interactive activities and roundtable discussions on social opportunities and community development needs. LaSafe organizers were intentional about ensuring that meetings were accessible to all community members. So over these 71 meetings and this 9-month process, the state and the Foundation for Louisiana integrated a lot of features to accomplish that. So they held extra meetings to enable greater participation. They provided meeting materials in non-English speaking languages so that way more people could participate. As I mentioned, they had a great program leading up to LaSafe that trained local facilitators so that way they could lead these processes instead of outside ex officio government members. And also they provided them stipends for their time. They also provided childcare and food so that way people who were working or who otherwise would have to stay home and couldn't participate because of other obligations could come and attend these meetings. Case studies like the ones we've discussed today and that Tiffany talked about are captured not only in our Adaptation Clearinghouse, but also the ones that I talked about today are covered in greater depth in a report that we put out to accompany the Toolkits release that includes 17 case studies specifically. We hope that you'll continue to engage with us on both Toolkits. As Tiffany mentioned, they're both living documents that are hosted online, and we love to hear from you and your feedback, beginning with the question and discussion session that Ella will facilitate. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Those were really fascinating presentations on very interesting and applicable tools. We will ask folks to send in questions via the questions box or the chat box. So please go ahead and do that. And I think I'll kick it off with a question that I have, which is these 2 toolkits are certainly not siloed efforts, right? They, there's crosswalk in between both of them. Do you have any examples of how both the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit and the Managed Retreat Toolkit have functioned together? Whether it's through community engagement or working in an underserved area. Do you have any examples of where they crosswalk?
Definitely. The LaSafe case study that Katie just spoke about is also featured in the Equity Toolkit for their community engagement process. Also, the Equitable Disaster chapter that I discussed has a section on equitable opportunities for relocation in response to disasters. And some of those case studies are managed retreat case studies, like LaSafe again. Also, the New Jersey Blue Acres buyout program is also centered in equity. So there are definitely cross references in both case studies. They're kind of explored from different angles, but definitely managed retreat processes that were implemented and centered in equity.
And in another regard to the procedural equity section that Tiffany went over in the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit is relevant to any climate adaptation discussions, but particularly challenging ones around managed retreat. So those principles will hopefully be applied in these types of processes on the ground and, you know, led and driven by communities.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. We have one question. If you could, do you both have the links to your toolkits, and would you be willing to drop them in the chat at whenever you can? If that's too difficult right now, we'll just send them out, but folks are asking if they can preview them. We have another question, and how about this? I'll ask the question and then I'll look for the toolkits and drop them in the chat while you guys answer the question. That might be easier. So the next question is, how can the land swap concept work with waterfront property when waterfront property is so much more valuable than inland swamp or maybe marsh areas?
Let's see, so great question. So with land swapped and the in-kind exchange of property, I think what this question is getting at is it doesn't have to be an in-kind sort of comparative or comparable value. So if you have, you know, coastal properties that are worth $1 million compared to some inland property that may not hold as great of a value, it doesn't have to be sort of a swap from an economic valuation standpoint to actually occur. Really the key here is getting two willing, at least a minimum of two willing property owners on both sides that for some reason have a motivation or a reason to want to swap properties. So where, you know, in this instance with the Los Cerritos example, you had, you know, an oil and gas production facility that was willing to trade 154 acres for 5. Clearly, at least from a spatial perspective, those aren't economically going to be valued the same, but the oil and gas production facility was able to consolidate its operations due to updates in technological advancements. And so it made sense for them to be able to do that. So I think in these instances, I encourage people to think creatively and not just from a real estate economic valuation perspective, but really seeing if there's land that can meet somebody's needs and if you could structure some type of transactional arrangement around that.
Great, thank you. Next question is about outreach strategies. Is there a section in the toolkits, one or both of them, that talks about best outreach strategies to get this information to and also to gather input from communities that might not have easy access to this sort of information or maybe have a barrier of education?
Yeah, it's not a specific section that, you know, would say outreach strategies, but I would turn to the community-driven engagement chapter as well for this type of subject, because in that chapter, there's a section called Utilizing General Frameworks and Guidance, where we include several resources that kind of give you guidance to how to properly, you know, engage the community, or like I said, the one that GCC worked on with DC, where we kind of highlighted our lessons learned. So you'll be able to find like an all-around guide to being able to engage the community, to being able to educate the community or utilize existing knowledge that's, you know, in the community to better, you know, prepare the community for these outcomes. So definitely go to that community-driven engagement process chapter, as well as I would say governance and budgeting for how to engage and how to reach out to those communities and have proper conversations.
Great, thank you. We'll continue to encourage folks to send in some questions, but I am curious to learn a little bit more about what sort of community, almost like community diagnostic, but community background work folks should do when they go into communities and take on either one of these toolkits. What are the demographic-based research that folks should do for understanding, you know, maybe the issues around the community or the background or the history or the resources? What sort of you know, baseline do people need when they enter communities to work on these projects?
I would say genuine relationship. I wouldn't go in without some kind of partnership. So you should utilize and see the community members as partners. You need like real collaboration. You shouldn't go in thinking, you know, like extractively. They are also here to help you get knowledgeable about the community and what's actually going on. So partnering with a community-based organization, or literally partnering with community members through advisory groups or committees, or however, whatever public meeting setting you need to do, is key. I think as a first step is, grounding yourself as, a relationship building process. And, here we are here to partner with you versus here we are to, help you, or here we are to extract from you. It's like we want to have a meaningful collaboration. So I would say the best way to do that is to partner with an existing community-based organization, because they already have their foot in the community, and make sure that they're a trusted organization as well, and kind of not look at this as a top-down process, but a bottom-up.
And to add to that, with a lot of these processes, a lot of the things that you're hearing about in the news in regards to managed retreat are things that are historically, underinvested in communities, tribal communities. So there's going to be sort of these cultural aspects and his systemic and historical racism. So how can you address that background going into these processes to ensure that the dialogues will be productive, and also, not already determinative, like, well, we've already decided you're going to move, so we're just going to come and ask you if you want to move, but really making it an actual sort of productive dialogue, as Tiffany is talking about, and go in there and understand that you may need to take a couple steps back, and you may not be able to start from the point of saying, all right, let's have a climate adaptation decision-making discussion. Maybe it's educating people first about, what flood risks they're facing, what are their range of options that they have on the table, or even behind that saying, all right, what do we need to do to establish an effective working relationship to be able to engage with you in the first place? So really knowing your audience, knowing where you're going, but also working to not just work with the community, but bringing in all the different people to the table who really need to be a part of these decisions. So at the federal, state, local level, because policymakers have to be brought in to be able to effectively let people know what options are on the table, where there is funding, where there is political support, that types of things. So really making them comprehensive, holistic decision-making processes.
Right, really interesting. So ensuring that also the community has a baseline understanding of what the issues are going on too, I imagine would be really important. That's fascinating. Thank you. Our next question is, we have found that only rich homeowners are in the process. The role of less wealthy inland residents to have a say in the future of the coast is left out. Have you studied any examples of how to better include inland residents that may not live directly on the coast in the planning process? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think this is a nice addition or segue from the previous question to this one. So again, you need to look at the scope of who is going to be affected by these types of decisions. And, with the definition that we've tried to build out from what we've heard from policymakers and stakeholders with managed retreat, is it's not just a matter of walking away from something, it's where are you going to, and how is that going to affect people in receiving areas, but also how can that affect, local tax bases and communities, culture, and like social cohesion if people leave, and all these different elements are intermixed. So, for governments to really, and communities to approach this comprehensively is what we're trying to recommend people do. One example that comes to mind is Norfolk, Virginia, engaged in sort of one of what's held up as one of the most, sort of resilient local planning examples in the nation. So in addition to their local comprehensive plan, they also worked to create a plan called Vision 2100, which looks at the impacts from climate change that they'll be facing out to sort of 100-year horizon. And they essentially divided the city up into 4 different zones, from ones where, for example, they'd have important infrastructure like from the Navy that they'd want to protect and stay in place, to areas where they would discourage new or future development because they'd be exposed to a lot of flood risk, to the higher ground areas where they're trying to encourage increased density and development where people may be moving. So that's one example of looking at things holistically. And I think, Louisiana with their LaSafe process is another example, because as I mentioned, the state is funding 10 adaptation projects, and that's not just along the coast, but also looking at these receiving areas where they've looked at demographic and economic trends of where people are going. So I'd cite those as 2 examples of where people are thinking about this holistically to really integrate those inland residents that aren't experiencing the coastal flooding into the discussion.
Great, thank you. That's fantastic. I'm curious to learn a little bit more. Tiffany, you mentioned that one of the case studies was modeled essentially after the the lessons learned from Hurricane Katrina and a couple other hurricanes. Are there any other examples of, you know, best practices that have come out of disasters? Because so much of this work that we do is unprecedented. That seems to be the word of 2020. Is, you know, we don't have any baseline for how to model these projects. Are there any other like examples of how you have used past disasters or past best practices or lessons learned to shape these decisions going forward?
I would say that pretty much all of these case studies are from something that went wrong and learned otherwise. There's a lot of like equitable recovery, like lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast, where New York and New Jersey has done a lot of implementation around the mess that was the response to Hurricane Sandy. Even Puerto Rico, they have a just recovery model that the community is leading and implementing through the Climate Justice Alliance that is coming out of the lessons learned from hurricanes that they've experienced. You know, all of this is a learning process, and I think when we realize which communities are being hit the hardest, it's from an existing, you know, impact that really hit that community so hard that, you know, now we're at the point where we actually have to address it for this community specifically versus just, you know, as a general whole. So I'm pretty sure that I would say that most of these are lessons learned. And for things like, you know, the Puerto Rico example, it's like not relying on that like fly in recovery aid and things like that, and like building resilience on the ground as far as making sure that your hospitals and things are energy resilient. That was one thing that they realized was the, you know, the biggest problem. So they're starting to work on microgrids. They're starting to incorporate more solar and independent energy resilience on the island. So it's all a learning process. I think that's the just in the key of the toolkit is that we draw those lessons learned from each case study and from each policy recommendation for you to make sure that you know exactly where to go with implementing in your own state or city or community.
Yeah, really interesting. So we're starting to learn then. Great. Well, we have gone through all of our questions, and I think that I'll give folks a few more seconds to see if they have anything else to submit.
One thing just to add to pick up on the sort of the theme of that question is I think a lot of people are coming to the question of like equitable adaptation and managed retreat from a perspective of, wow, this has never happened before. How are we going to do this? Let's completely reinvent the wheel. And I think as both of our products show, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel, and more often than not, there are places that have done this and learned from it. And so you can save time, you can save resources, you can save, heartache and troubles by looking and trying to learn from other people. And, a lot of the things, the tools that we talk about in both toolkits have actively been applied. I mean, for the managed retreat toolkit, hazard mitigation buyouts are talked about a lot. And they're increasingly being used in a coastal context, but they've traditionally been used in a riverine context. So there are longstanding programs that have been around for 20, 30 years that people can learn from, and they don't have to start at square one or square zero. So thinking about this in a more productive way versus just saying, wow, we have this huge challenge in front of us, we have no idea what to do. Maybe somebody does, and try to promote those peer learning opportunities that we can help with or others can help with, like through your Coastal Resilience Network, to start thinking about potentially moving towards helping people have productive conversations versus just focusing on the challenge and sort of the burdens and barriers ahead of you.
And to piggyback off of that, like I said before, partnerships are key. There is always an organization out there who's probably already doing the work or the expert in a particular section of work that you don't know much about. Meaningful partnership has been the key of GCC. Like we do on the ground workplace-based work in DC, and we work with the DC government all the time, to do proper community engagement and actually implement climate plans here in the district. And we work in other place-based jurisdictions as well. So you know, finding the right partners is always the easiest route because they might know something that you don't, and you know, why not work with someone else who already knows?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure getting community buy-in that's, the best way to do that and ensuring a successful project, making sure everyone is on board and sharing the same goals. Thank you both so much. I don't see any further questions, so I think we will end here for the day. Thank you so much, Tiffany Ganthier and Katie Spidalieri, for your time and your expertise on this amazing topic. Folks, this webinar is recorded and we will be sending out a follow-up email. So thank you all very much, and take a look for that email, and have a great Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.